Right, just get myself in the shots. So I am all wired for sounds. It's amazing the things you learn while keeping a reef tank that have absolutely nothing to do with a reef tank. But anyway, hopefully the sound will be fine. I thought I'd try and get a bit more of the tank in for the background, so if you get bored of listening to me, you can watch the fish. Right, so today's topic is going to be, clues in the title really, but it's going to be about ozone. So I'm going to do this in 3 bits. Firstly, I'm going to look at the sort of chemical composition of O3, and the reason I'm going to do this is because there's lots of videos out on YouTube talking about ozone, and all the ones I've watched so far, in my opinion, have not sufficiently explained to me how ozone works at a kind of a molecular chemical level. Everyone just goes where it's a 3-part molecule of oxygen and it disinfects, cleans your water. It doesn't really tell me how it does it. I start asking a politician something, you know, and give a generic answer. Yes, so I'm going to deal with the chemistry and hopefully explain in a bit more detail how ozone actually cleans your water. Then I'm going to talk about ozone generators and how we kind of make the ozone, and then I'm going to tell how I implement ozone into my tank, which is going to be pretty much the same for anyone else who runs a reef tank. There's not many ways of doing it really. I would say probably 90% of people do it in the same manner. So I put that on the end. I will put a short video in of the unit that I'm using. So that's basically where we are. So, I mean, ozone has been around for a long time. Excuse me. It was probably first made in, I think it was 1785, by, like most things in science, by accident. And the guy who made it noticed the kind of a smell, which is often likened to the smell you get after an electrical storm. I've smelled ozone. That's not the smell that sprung into my head, if I'm honest. I mean, it's got a very distinctive smell. I don't really know how I would describe it. But yeah, I mean, once you smell it, you know. He's just drinking a cup of tea, sorry. Right. And so the molecular formula, the actual kind of O3 and the bonding patterns between those 3 oxygen molecules wasn't actually kind of worked out until 1865, which is a great year for science because that's when Darwin published his Origin of Species. So a good year. And then 100 years later I was born. So anyway, so ozone is described as a colourless or possibly a pale blue gas, and it is made from 3 atoms of oxygen combining. So if you look over there at that little animation, that will show you the process in the atmosphere of how ozone is made. So basically it needs energy to split bonds and then reform bonds. So basically you're splitting a oxygen molecule, which is 2 atoms of oxygen. They're being forced apart by energy, and then they're coming back together, and sometimes they come back together as a trio, as 3 oxygen atoms rather than the normal 2, which is the more stable molecule of oxygen. So in order to kind of explain how that works and what makes ozone oxidative, which is something that oxidizes, we need to have a quick chemistry lesson on how oxygen atom is comprised. And basically it's to do with the electrons. So if you remember, if you look at the periodic table, oxygen is number 8. That generally means it's got 8 protons, 8 neutrons and 8 electrons. So the protons are positive, neutrons are neutral, and the electrons are negative. So if you've got 8 protons and 8 electrons, then essentially you've got a neutral charged atom. Now the electrons, which if you remember from school, spin around in orbits. So you've got a nucleus in the middle, and then spinning around them you have electrons. Now these electrons are in what they call orbits or shells. And if you do like A-level chemistry, which is what I'm trying to drag back into my head, the electrons run in set kind of orbits, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you have more and more electrons as they spread out. So you have, for example, in oxygen, you've got a 1s orbital, a 2s orbital, and a p or 2p orbital, which contain the 8 electrons which spin around the nucleus. So the first two in the 1s orbital are fixed. They're what we call non-valent. So they're not really involved in any chemical interactions that the oxygen molecule or the oxygen atom is going to take place to. They just sit very close to the nucleus and spin around, don't really do much. Then we move outside, so we know we've got 8 electrons, so 2 of them are already there, just sitting there, not really interacting. The other 6 are what we call valent electrons, and they are able to interact with other atoms, because to fill that outer shell we really want 8 electrons, but oxygen's only got 6. So that's the dog. I'm boring the dog. So what happens is, the reason oxygen is a 2-part molecule, is 2 atoms of oxygen, is that they tend to share 2 electrons on the outer orbit from each other, and they kind of spin together and form what we call a covalent bond. So that's called by electrons in the shell. They kind of cross over into each other's orbit, so to speak, and then they form a bond, and that's called a covalent bond. It's a strong bond. It's a very common bond throughout chemistry, organic chemistry, polymers, carbon, all has covalent bonding. So what happens then is, to make ozone, is that covalent bond gets broken and another oxygen atom is forced in there. So you now got 18 electrons. So that third oxygen molecule does not want to be there, doesn't want to form that molecule. It's desperately trying to grab electrons from any other source it can, so that it can split off and make a better, more stable molecule. And that process of ripping electrons away from another substance, and it's particularly good at doing this between carbon double bonds, is called oxidation. So to oxidize something, you're ripping electrons away from it and added them to this, in this case, the oxygen molecule. So it breaks away from the 2 and it will go off and join with whatever it can get. So it's basically, oxidation is just about ripping electrons away. And what that does is it breaks bonds. It's breaking chemical bonds by pulling the electrons out of a bond from another substance and breaking it down. And essentially, because most of the stuff in our tank is of sort of organic origin, a lot of carbon bonds, ozone is extremely good at breaking those bonds, so breaking down those discolouring agents in our water. It also breaks down like the encapsulated viruses, the protein coats there, bacterial coat, so it can do that as well. I mean, it's indiscriminate, it just wants electrons and it will rip them from wherever it can. So that is essentially what ozone does. It just breaks down bonds, which is why you have to be careful and what material you're using when you're running ozone in your tank, because it can be very destructive. So hopefully that kind of explains how it works and why it works. So there are 2 main ways to make it. The first, as I've mentioned, and you saw in that little kind of animation, is from light. So UV light is of sufficient energy to break those bonds between the two oxygen atoms, and it's about 185 nanometer, I think, is the wavelength. This tends to break those apart, and then they form back, and some of them will form as O3. I'm not aware of anything in the hobby which uses that method to make ozone. I know there is a UV sterilizer which I think possibly may say that it makes ozone. I think that's more of a byproduct, but I don't have any detail on that. I've got something in my head that tells me there's something out there. But the main way that it's made is using electricity with a coronal discharge plate, which I'll put a image up there. Basically that's just a negative and a positive, and there's a dielectric plate which helps to spread the electricity across it, and it travels across the space from the negative to the positive, and through that space you pass mainly air. In the hobby we just pump air through it. Obviously if you're a medical institution or something, you can pump pure oxygen through there and get a much more higher output of ozone. But for us, we just pump normal air through it, and then a percentage of that will be broken down, the bonds will be split, and when they reform there'll be ozone, and then we push it into our water. So the thing about ozone is you cannot store it, really. You can't buy a compressed gas cylinder of ozone. You can't buy a 2-litre container with liquid ozone in it. So it has to be made at the point where you want it, which is why we run ozone generators. And it's very unstable, so it doesn't stick around for long, as I've already said, because it's electron hungry and it will break down anything it comes into contact with, or most things it comes into contact with, and then it's not O3 anymore. Right, let's just have a little sip. So I think that's enough on the actual ozone molecule itself. So now if we turn to how we use it or make it for the reefing hobby, there's a number of manufacturers that make ozone generators. They all use the same principle. It's that corona plate which I described earlier. Ozotech are big in the States. As far as I'm aware, they're not in Europe. There's Aquamedic make ozone generators for the aquarium trade. There's Weir Pro, which I think are Chinese. There's Anili, I don't know how you say that, A-N-A-L-Y, which are Chinese. They've been around for quite a while. And Sander, which are German. They all use the same principle of a coronal discharge plate by passing air through the electric field to break the bonds and make ozone. So they all do the same thing basically. So when you buy, I was going to try and take my unit off and kind of show it to you, but I'll put a picture of just a normal ozone unit. They look very similar to an air pump, really. You know, they come in different sizes and they tend to have a knob which goes from 1 to 10. The unit I use, so I did use an Aquamedic 250, which I understand is 250 milligrams per hour output maximum. That broke after less than a year, which I wasn't impressed with. I never answered any emails when I made some inquiries, so I chucked it in the bin. So my personal experience would be I wouldn't recommend Aquamedic. I then bought a Weir Pro, which is a 200 milligram per hour unit, much cheaper, because it's £135 for the Aquamedic, and I think it was £52 for the Weir Pro. The Aquamedic felt like an empty box. It was really light plastic, it felt cheap, even though it wasn't. Whereas the Weir Pro is probably 4 times the weight and costs considerably less. And I'm still using it. It seems to be working fine. Sander, I don't know. They are. I think their 200 milligram per hour unit is £240, and I've got no idea how much the Ozone stuff is because it's not available. So I didn't really spend a lot of time looking at it. So they all do the same thing basically. One thing people may not know is that you have to drive air through them in order to make them work properly. When I first bought the Aquamatic unit, I thought the skimmer would have enough draw on the air intake to pull enough air through, but it didn't work at all basically. So you have to have an air pump which drives air through the unit. So basically you have a little box and you have an input and an output. So you have an air input and an ozone output, and you just put normal air line from the pump into the airline input, and then you pump air through it, and then once the unit is on, you'll have ozone coming out the output, and then that can either be fed into your skimmer or it can be fed into a ozone reactor. And all you're looking for basically is contact time with the water as the ozone gets released. So that's essentially it. So in terms of the different units, other than the price, most of the units up in the Ozone I don't think do any replaceable parts. I know Weir Pro, actually you can buy a new plate on the bottom where it's like a metal plate where the 2 spigots come out, which you connect your input and your outputs. I don't know if that's just to replace them in case they get rusty, or I don't know. I'm pretty sure it has nothing to do with prolonging the length of the corona discharge plate inside. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's nothing to do with that. So essentially they're a kind of set and forget, and then once they are no longer working, you throw them away. Ozone I know are different. Their units are bigger, like physically bigger anyway. So even if you buy the 200 milligram, 250 milligram per hour, the actual unit itself is larger. And I'm pretty sure that you can buy replacement corona discharge units. And they make a specific unit to dehumidify the air before it gets to the unit. So the other thing about ozone is to make that corona discharge plate much more effective, is to try and remove the humidity of the air that you're pumping through it. So they, Ozone make a specific unit for that, which I think it's kind of like a self-contained, I'd imagine it's got silica beads in it, or it's got something similar to that. It dries the air, but then I think it's got like 2 cartridges, switch, and it will dry one while you're using the other one, and then you can switch over automatically. I think it makes it less kind of user intensive. Whereas the other units, you can buy your own air dryer. So you could just use a DI resin chamber, fill it with silicone beads, and just pull your airline through it. If you can use colour changing beads. A lot of those silica beads you can then dry in the oven. So you drive the moisture back out of them, and they change. They might change from like purple to blue, or yellow to green, or whatever. There's all different. So is it worth doing? Well, I tried to look at some numbers. There's not a lot of information out there, but I did find that the Chinese company, and Neely, or whatever they're called, they claim to get 250% efficiency out of drying the air before it goes through the corona discharge plate. So basically, if you've got a 200 milligram an hour unit and you're drying your air, you're going to get 500 milligrams per hour. I mean, it's a massive difference, 250%. And so, and you can buy like 2 kilos of silica beads for, I think it's £20 or £30. I don't know how long they'd last, obviously, everyone's going to be different, but I would probably recommend trying it if you're going to go down the route of using Ozone. I might try it myself. So I've been using Ozone for 14 months, something like that. I don't have high humidity in the fish room because it's quite well ventilated. I mean, the humidity in here is lower than it is in the outside because I take active measures to vent it and get the humidity down. Which is why there's never any condensation or anything in this fish room. But I mean, for the sake of £20, I might just buy some silica beads and see whether it makes a difference. It's very hard to actually, what's the word I'm looking for, put in precise doses of ozone into your tank. It's a difficult thing to measure because basically a dial goes to 1 to 10. It doesn't start at 0 anyway, so even if it's on 1, that's not like percentage wise not accurate, I think, as far as I know it isn't anyway. So you're kind of dosing it blindly, because even though my unit says it's 200 milligrams an hour, it's not going to be 100% efficient, so I doubt it's putting out 200 milligrams an hour. I don't know what the 1 would start at. Does that start at 10%? Does it start at 40%? I don't know. There's a minimum charge that they have to put through a corona plate for all of it to work. So all of these things are unexplained in all of the units I've looked at. So really what you're using when you're dosing ozone into your tank is you're just looking at your water and seeing if it's crystal clear. And then my approach is to use it as little as I can to get the effect that I want, basically. So when I first started using the Aquamedic, I was using it 24/7. I just left it running. I started at the lowest setting for a week, and then I took 10 weeks basically, because each week I went up a notch until I was at the highest setting of 10. And the water was absolutely gin clear. So I must say that of all the things we do on our tank, most things, you see small incremental improvements at best. It's very rare that you put something in your tank, on day 1, and on day 2 you come in and go, oh my God, that is amazing. And that's basically what Ozone will do. So the reason I use it is because my tank is 13 foot long, and I like to sit at the end and look down the length of the tank. It's a nice view. It's a 13 foot view down the tank's nice. You can watch the fish swim towards you, etc. And so I found that 13 foot was cloudy, basically, because it's a lot of water to look through. So that's the reason I chose Ozone. And then after I ran it, I set it up, let's say I set it up on a Sunday, I came in on a Monday morning and I was blown away by just how absolutely crystal clear the water was. So it really does make it, it's like night and day. I mean, it is such a difference. So if anyone runs carbon on their tank and then the day after they look at their tank and go, wow, that looks good, you can get that every single day without any of the faff of having to buy carbon, use carbon, have a reactor for carbon, remember that you've run in carbon, no fines in your tank, no black rubbish on the sink, and it's just none of the hassle, because Ozone is extremely easy to implement into your equipment in your tank once you buy the right stuff. So do you need Ozone? No, not at all. Most tanks run without Ozone. If you want crystal clear water, I mean absolutely gin clear, until you see it you cannot believe how just amazingly clean it is, then yeah, I would suggest that you give Ozone a try. And it's not particularly expensive, really. I mean, that unit, it's a 3,000 litre tank, it cost me £52 for a unit off of Amazon. So if it lasts me a year, it's a damn sight cheaper than one if I was running carbon. And I've never run carbon because I've got a lot of tangs in the tank, and other than the fact that I don't like the mess that carbon makes, I don't like the idea of getting those little particulate fines in the water which can possibly irritate tanks, so I don't use it. Right, so what do you need to run ozone in your tank? You must have compatible equipment, because I've already said ozone likes to break bonds, chemical bonds at a molecular level, and it will do that very efficiently with things like rubber. So if your skimmer does not use silicone O-rings, for example, on its pumps, they will corrode extremely quickly with the use of ozone. So you have to have an ozone rated skimmer if you're going to use a skimmer. If you don't have an ozone rated skimmer, then you can either buy one, obviously, or you can use a dedicated ozone reactor, which is very similar to any reactor. It just allows you to pass ozone through it, and it gives contact time with the water. That's all you want, really. So if you are using it with a skimmer, you need an ozone rated skimmer. The line from your output of your ozone generator to your skimmer needs to be silicon. So I'm going to put insert a video there of my setup, which is very simple. So I've already said, I've got the Weir Pro 200 milligram an hour unit. I run it from a Eheim diaphragm air pump, which is just hanging on the wall, and the output from the, excuse me, God, the output from the ozone generator goes into my air intake on my skimmer. So I just cut, you can see the on the video, I've just cut the red silicone tubing on my skimmer, and I've inserted a T-piece. I will just mention, I bought Royal Exclusive Ozone T-piece. They specifically sell for use of ozone. It lasted literally 8 days and then snapped through the ozone running through it, which I was like, well, what's that about then? You sell it to be used for ozone. I used it for just over a week and it broke. So I was looking for ozone resilient material. There are certain plastics out there. I tried a couple, but they all go very brittle and then they snap. So that is actually Pyrex glass that I bought. I think it might be D&D. But anyway, yeah, so I just bought that online and I've used that. That's been there for over a year now and it's solid. Yeah, so you have to be very careful what you use. And the trouble is that because I used the Royal Exclusive T-piece to start with and it snapped in the night, and I was running ozone 24/7, and I came in the morning and this place absolutely stank of ozone because it'd be just pumping into the fish room all night. So, not recommended really. So yeah, so I use a Pyrex T-piece, glass T-piece to run into my skimmer. So the other thing I do is I greatly reduce the amount that I use it. So I was, as I said, using it 24/7 and the water was absolutely gin clear, but it was harsh obviously on the equipment. So I said I broke the T-piece, and I was also getting ozone being emitted through the top of the skimmer lid. So initially I put little bags of carbon on the skimmer lid, because the good thing about carbon is, because as I said earlier, ozone loves breaking the covalent bonds between carbon atoms. So if you put carbon anywhere near ozone, it absolutely breaks down the ozone instantly, neutralises it. So if you put those little bags on top of your skimmer, you will not smell any ozone at all because it just gets absorbed instantly. But it sounds simple, but that's a pain in the arse really, because every time you want to clean your skimmer, you've got to move them off. It does block those holes as well because you put carbon over them, so the skimmer doesn't work as efficiently as it should. Yeah, so basically it's just easier to turn the ozone generator down. So I went from using it for 24/7 basically on full power, and now I only run it. I thought I'd run it for 2 hours, but I don't. I actually run it for 3 hours, and I have it automated. It comes on in the middle of the night, really. So I've got the air pump on a timer, just a timer switch, and the ozone generator is plugged into my Apex energy bar. So basically at 2 o'clock the air pump comes on, at 1 minute past 2 the ozone generator comes on, and then at 5 o'clock I think the ozone generator goes off, and then at 1 minute past 5 the air pump gets turned off. So all of that takes place while I'm not even in the fish room, and that basically means that when I come in the morning, I'm generally coming here about 8:30, give them their first feed, and I spend some time in here. The water's absolute gin clear, and I can just sit here and enjoy it, and all of that's taken place while I've been sleeping, which is perfect. Excuse me. Yeah. So I would recommend erring on the side of caution, and when you buy a ozone generator, they really use quite low wattage. I mean, I think this Weir Pro uses somewhere between 6 and 10 watts. I think the Sander one I looked at, it was under 20 watts, it might have been 16 watts or something. So even though it says it uses high energy to break those bonds, in terms of energy consumption, it's really low. You know, you think of the other stuff we have in this hobby. So they're very cheap to run. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of positives to be said. So it breaks down the discoloring agents in the water. What it doesn't do, I mean, it will break down some of the bacteria, it will break down some of the algae, because they're all organic and it's very good at breaking those bonds. What it doesn't do is fight fish parasites. So it is not going to be any advantage to running ozone if you're trying to treat for, you know, all of those pathogens, ick, velvet, Rickenella, any of these things, because if that's what you want to do, you're going to have to run so much ozone in your water that you're going to kill your fish and everything else in there. So you're not going to use it at a level sufficiently strong enough or disinfectant enough to get rid of any fish diseases. I haven't noticed any behavioural differences in my fish since running it at all, which is exactly what I want, really. The only thing which happens, which could be correlated, or it could be one of these just, you know, typical reefing thing, is that 3 months after I started using the Aquamedic, I had an outbreak. I had very small patches of cyanobacteria, which I'd never seen in my tank before. So that kind of led me to believe that maybe I have disrupted the bacterial balance in the tank. So maybe I've skewed it towards cyano inadvertently by using ozone. Because I'd never seen cyano in my tank before. And now I've dialed it right back, and I'm only using it for those 3 hours a night. I'm not seeing it anymore either. So I did take measures to correct the cyano. So I had different strains of bacteria, and I did something. Oh, and I looked at the trace elements as well, because they'd gone out. So it could be related to that. It could be absolutely nothing to do with it. But I'm just saying that at the time when I added the ozone to my tank, 3 months later, I saw the cyano, and for the 2 years previously, I'd never seen it. So I don't know whether that's a correlation or whether that's just me making one. But I thought I'd mention it. So my take-home message would be, really, if you're going to buy a ozone generator, when you look at the technical details of the unit, so let's say, for example, you've got a 500 litre tank, and it will say, right, the 100 milligram an hour will do 50 litres to 500 litres. The 200 milligram an hour will do 500 litres to 3,000 litres. If you've got a 500 litre tank, buy the smaller unit. You do not, one, you don't need to put a lot of ozone in there to get that crystal clear water. And two, there's no point having a unit where if you've got a 500 litre tank and your unit can do 3,000 litres, if it does go south, chances are it won't, but if it does, it's like a heater. You know, you always buy a heater which is, even if it gets stuck on, theoretically it's not going to have enough grunt to boil your tank, so which is why you'll run 2 or 3 heaters. And this is exactly the same philosophy here. Do not buy a unit which, if it gets stuck on or something goes wrong with your mechanism that you put in place to control it, if that breaks down and the unit stays on, you don't want it to be sufficiently strong enough to kill everything in your tank. That's just me thinking that's a very sensible way to approach it. I would rather have a unit which, if it got stuck on, is going to get my AWP up to 450, 500 even, but not kill everything, than have something that if it gets stuck on, I'm going to come in the morning and everything's going to be stone dead and it's going to stink like I've had a lightning strike in my fish room. So that would be my suggestion. Always go for the lower, because my experience is you really don't need a lot of ozone. I mean, that's a 200 milligram an hour unit I'm using on a 3,000 litre tank, and it gives me absolutely crystal clear water. So I don't really understand why I would want a huge unit, other than if someone can argue the fact to me that, one, it will last me a decade if I buy a bigger unit, maybe it's more efficient, cheaper to run, blah 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 blah, but as far as I'm aware, I've not seen that argument made. So for me, I would buy a smaller unit and not run the risk. Right, so I think that's about it, isn't it? Yeah, ozone rips electrons, breaks bonds, gets rid of the discoloring agents in your water. You don't need to use a lot of it. Oh, I should say, yeah, because I didn't mention this at all, did I? In terms of controlling the amount you put in, because I've said that there's just a button that goes 1 to 10, it doesn't really give you a lot of information. You don't know how effective your unit is. I'd imagine when you buy it at the beginning, it's a lot more effective than it is 12 months down the line. So I'd imagine that your output will probably taper off. But it's very difficult to work out exactly how much ozone you're putting in. So you need to use a AWP probe, which is the kind of redox potential of your water, because ozone will raise that. So if you pump in a lot of ozone, it will just continually go up. So you need to know roughly where your tank sits before you use ozone. And then you can set in boundaries to turn your ozone generator off if it gets too high, basically. So you just want some mechanism to be able to control the amount of ozone going in. So I kind of do 2 things. So first step, as I've already said, I've got it on a timer, so it only runs for 3 hours out of every 24 hours. So that in itself should not. So hold on, right. So let's go. So it's an undersized unit, yeah? So my unit is half the size it says it should be. So it's, I think it's 1,500 litres of salt water. If you're using fresh water, you can double it, or half it for salt water. So I'm pretty sure mine says it's about 1,500 litres of salt water, right? So I've got 3,000, so I've already halved the size unit. So I've got that safety factor in there. I only run it for 3 hours out of 24 hours, and I have it on a timer which is controlled by my Apex. So I've got that control there, and then I've also got my AWP probe set that if my AWP goes above 425 and the ozone generator is on, it will switch it off. So I've also got that mechanism of controlling there. So I've never had to turn my ozone generator off using my AWP reading and my apex, because it doesn't get to 425. So my my AWP used to be around 300, 350. Now I use the ozone, it's lows of about 370 and it gets up to around 400. So that's that kind of 24-hour pattern. So it goes down to 370 and then goes up to about 400, and that's the sort of boundary it sits in, really. But you definitely need to have an AWP controller, and you need some mechanism to be able to switch it off should it get too high. And AWPs in tanks are very different. Some people run at 500s and they don't even run ozone. Other people run at 250s, 270s. You know, each tank is different from the biological makeup. So you just need to know where yours is, and then you need to set your ranges. So that's how I run mine. And I would suggest, you know, you put in at least 2 layers of redundancy, really. Just in case. It's like everything else, you know. I think ozone gets a bad rap because it is an aggressive molecule and it will cause damage. But you can say that about nearly everything in this hobby. If you have a big enough margin of error in basically anything you do in your tank, you know, if you whack your lights on at 100% and they never turn off for 3 days, you've killed every coral in your tank. You know, if your salinity goes way up, way down, you're going to kill everything in your tank. You know, there's just so many ways to kill everything in your tank. So this is why we try and constrain everything and have redundancies in place, so we don't get any spikes, any troughs, any peaks. And ozone is exactly the same. But I will say that I absolutely do enjoy running ozone on the tank. And I find out of all the things, it is exceptionally easy to do. Once it's set up, it really is a set and forget kind of thing. All you need to do is, like maintenance wise, what I do, even though I've got 100% silicone hose on the outlet, you will notice that that end of that hose on the outlet spigot will perish. It will become, the silicone it's weird, it goes almost sticky. And what happens is that the lumen, the bore in the middle, will stick together. So every probably 3 or 4 months, I chop an inch off, and then I just reconnect it. So yeah, I mean, that's silicone, which is meant to be, you know, 100% ozone. It's not actually. So that's what I do. I don't really think I do anything else. And if you want to know whether it is working, there's 2 ways to do that. One is you can buy ozone detectors. I haven't actually got one. I've got a CO2 detector and humidity, because I like to keep an eye on the CO2 in a room for pH. But you can buy ozone detectors if you're worried. If you have it in your house, you've got kids, etc. You can buy that. It's like a carbon monoxide detector, you know, same thing. Or if you want to know if your generator is still working, you can do what I do. Probably not something you should do, but I just smell it. I just take the hose off and have a sniff and go, yeah, and then I put it back on. That's it, really. Right, I think that probably covers everything on ozone. Yeah, that's it, really. So I hope that is of some use. Like I say, I've been using it for probably 14, 15 months. Other than a unit breaking, I think it's one of the best things I've done, to be honest. I mean, obviously, I think it would probably work better on a bigger tank, because looking down 13 foot of crystal clear water, I mean, it's hard to emphasise just how stunningly clear it is. I mean, you know, it's better than carbon, I think. It is just amazingly clear. It is, and it does get rid of some odours as well, actually. Also, the other thing I would say is that there are various reports on how it affects your skimmer when you run your ozone through it. So some people go, it works better, they pull out more skimmate, the bubbles are better and more of them or whatever, I don't know. Other people go, it suppresses their bubbles and the skimmer is less efficient. I'm right in the middle of that because I've got to be honest, I haven't noticed any difference from when I do run ozone through the skimmer and when I don't. Obviously at the moment I can't see it because it happens at night, but when I was running it 24/7 I didn't see any noticeable difference in the operation of my skimmer. It still looked exactly the same. You know, the bubbles look the same, the skimmate looked the same, the amount it pulled looked the same. So the only difference I ever saw was that the water in the tank was absolutely gin clear. Right, so that was it. I don't know if I talked about the cost of the units. Yeah, I did, didn't I? Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very cheap way of getting extremely clean water with very little effort if you've got the right things in place. So you need, really the main thing you need is a skimmer which is rated for ozone. And even though they are rated for ozone, I reckon if you put a lot of ozone through it 24/7, I think all skimmers are going to fail at some point, whether it's the O-rings on the pump or just the body of the skimmer becoming brittle. So even though I did that to start with, I don't do it now, and I wouldn't recommend anyone else do it either, really, unless you're running something, you know, colossal. But for most of us, you only need a very little bit of ozone to get a very good result, and that's where I would leave it. I think I'm done. So hopefully that it will give you some information on running ozone and how it works, and whether you think you would like it or not. So yeah, that's it. Ozone, brilliant, love it, do it.